Well, aren't you amazing? I've had some pretty hard acts to follow, but that's kind of ridiculous. I don't dance, I don't sing, I just talk. I've been involved in this issue for a very long time, nearly 40 years now, working on these questions of sustainability from every possible angle. So I started as a young activist at the age of 14 on secondary students' issues in Melbourne. I went through anti-apartheid issues, training myself at the gates of the South African Embassy when I was 16. In Canberra, I worked on Aboriginal land rights questions, anti-nuclear weapons issues, whole range of questions, and then joined the military, which was kind of a bit strange for my family especially. Still changed the world, but in a different kind of way. And I served in the Australian Air Force for a while, then I left there and became an anti-nuclear weapons activist again, driving inflatable boats in front of nuclear warships, still involved in the military, but on a kind of different angle. Chasing aircraft carriers around Sydney Harbour. They were bigger than I was, but we still had fun. And I then went from there into lots of different environmental causes, Jervis Bay campaign, ended up joining Greenpeace, fighting toxic pollution, got involved in climate change around then, which was around the kind of late 80s. After working on the ozone issue, realising the atmosphere and climate change was kind of the thing we should be really starting to worry about, so nearly 25 years ago. And then became head of Greenpeace Australia, became head of Greenpeace International, worked in Amsterdam, lived there with my family for a few years with Greenpeace International, and really sort of got this issue from a global perspective. And so a very different kind of worldview to think about it in that kind of role. Very cool job to have, of course, being head of Greenpeace International with your own Navy, kind of last laugh on being the Air Force. And then left there really fascinated by this idea of the role of the corporation, the role of business, the role of markets to drive change. And went into business, formed two companies during that next 20-year period, one doing strategy consulting to large corporates, which was, really trying to understand how does change occur, what works and what doesn't work in terms of changing markets. Work with very large companies, DuPont, Ford Motor Company, BHP Billiton, all sorts of good and bad companies, trying to help them to understand how to see this issue as a business question from within their worldview. I also had a business called Easy Being Green, which is a particularly exciting entrepreneurial company with a couple of hundred staff doing installing light bulbs. We all changed our light bulbs, but we changed 6 million light bulbs, which was pretty extraordinary, cut 4 million tonnes of CO2, and really kind of found the power of entrepreneurial business and what an incredible impact that can have in terms of mobilising people to get a lot of stuff done very quickly. So having spent kind of 20 years in the corporate sector, I then moved back into kind of what I do now, which is kind of all of the above, not so much the military part, but everything else, all of the above. And working with business, I'm a fellow at the University of Cambridge, trying to understand how systems work and how systems change. I talk to conferences like this, I do a bit of corporate stuff, a lot of NGO activism, a lot of writing, wrote a book called The Great Disruption on how this issue is going to unfold. The reason I say all that, apart from the fact that the organisers asked me to, is to say I think about the system as a whole, right? So I don't think just about climate change or this issue or the ecosystem. I try to understand what works and what doesn't work, because I, after 40 years, like you, probably in most cases a bit less time, get really frustrated. This is like so obvious what we need to do. It's so clear what the science says. It's so obvious what the threat is if we don't act. Then what is wrong with us? What is wrong with people? What is going on that we don't kind of respond to this blindingly clear present danger that we face as a society, and what is the process of change that unfolds? So I think a lot about that, and my book was really focused on that issue. How does change occur? What is it that triggers change, and when is it that we get round to doing stuff that's really big? And the short answer I've come to in that sort of examination is that we tend to do it the way we're doing it on climate change. We tend to wait. We tend to deny, delay, avoid, do anything we can to argue against having to act when acting is difficult. It's a very consistent pattern: personal health, company health, national crises, global issues, even things like World War II. It wasn't like Hitler suddenly became a threat when he invaded Poland. It was kind of blindingly obvious. The science of the time said we have a really clear threat, we have a really clear danger, we should respond. So Churchill, kind of in 1936, 1937, would have felt like we feel today. He would have looked around and said, what is wrong with you people? Isn't it so blindingly obvious how bad it is? And the people who argued against him were saying things like, well, look, I know it's bad, but it's not that bad. And it's like it mightn't be as bad as you think it is, and it's really expensive to fix it, and we're going to have to all change, and it's complicated, and maybe we should wait and see how it unfolds before we sort of overreact and do things that are too big and too dramatic. And Churchill would have been tearing his hair out when he was sober enough to find it. He was drunk, he was depressed, he was an alcoholic, right? And I can see why, right? I've managed to avoid that so far, most of the time. But it's like you must have driven him nuts, right? And he was written off as a lunatic, written off as yesterday's man, old militarist trying to use his position to try and argue for military intervention for its own sake. He was seen as yesterday's tired old, person who'd lost his way. And then suddenly he becomes one of the world's great leaders. Suddenly he goes down in history as being the person we needed at the right time and achieved extraordinary levels of change incredibly quickly. Now, the point is, he was a drunk, depressed alcoholic before, he was a drunk, depressed alcoholic afterwards, and what changed was the context. Now, that is a really important lesson for us as to how change occurs, is that we put it off and we delay, we wait until the last minute, till nothing else can possibly get in the way, until we really have to act now, then we wait a bit longer, right, and then we do it. And we do that very consistently, and that's the lesson of World War II. It's the lesson of so many crises, is that we wait and then we panic, and then we respond, and then we do extraordinary things. And let's remember, if you had to analyse what was needed in World War II before it started, and explained how the story was going to unfold, let alone the tragedy and the deaths and the horror, just in terms of economic mobilisation and change, any rational person would have said, that's impossible to achieve. It's too late. We can't do it. And yet the most extraordinary things happened around the world as a result, and that was a successful response to what was then an incredible threat. So don't ever underestimate how fast we can act when we get our act together, and extraordinary things can then happen. So let's think about that in our context. Let's think about what this movement is and who it is, who we are and what we have to do. First of all, let's just remember how change occurs in today's world. It occurs in very complex ways. I've always thought, and we've always thought, mostly as activists and business people and as campaigners and as politicians, that we do this, we ask for this, point A, and then point B happens and we respond. And that's kind of the case if you're stopping the damming of the Franklin or protecting a forest. But when you're doing system-wide change, it doesn't work like that. It works in a lot of complex and different ways. And lots of little levers get pulled, right? And then the system gets to a certain critical mass and then it shifts. And it's very hard to know when it's going to shift, and it's often hard to see it shifting when it's in process. We've seen some great examples of this recently in terms of the boom in the solar power industry. We are seeing, after 40 years of solar power being cheap 20 years away, right, we've kind of finally got there, right? And we've got there because of a complex system change. So yes, Germany had put in place feed-in tariffs that drove massive production in China. As a result of that action happening in China, the prices dropped globally. And as a result of prices dropping globally, entrepreneurs like Danny Kennedy from the company Sungevity in the US, old Greenpeace friend of mine, has this company putting solar panels on roofs. Now, he can do that because Google invented Google Maps, which allows him to go and look at houses and give you a quote for the solar system with a picture of your house from Google Maps with a solar system implanted upon it, because someone thought about geographical information systems. And then he got finance from someone who thought coal's looking a bit dicky, I should go and invest some money in solar, or lend some money to them to lend to householders so they can get a loan to make putting on solar cheaper than buying power from the utility was. So the point of that was that Danny Kennedy thinks he's really smart with his business model, and the Chinese think they're really smart because they do mass production of solar energy and solar power very cheaply, and the German policy people think they did it because they put in place the feed-in tariffs, and they're all kind of right? And Google thinks they did everything. So we'll give them some credit because it makes them feel good. And that was a really important part of it too, and the scientists who thought about geographical information systems, they were a really important part of it too. Now the point is they're all right and they're all wrong. It's the system changed. Now coal in America is currently going through a dreadful, tragic demise. The average market cap of some very large coal companies has dropped 70% in the last year, which is really bad for them, and they feel very bad about it, and I feel very, very bad for them. No, I don't at all. I feel really good about that, and I feel good about that because it's the system changing. The system is changing because the foundations in the US have put in, get this, around $700 million into campaigning against every coal port, every coal train line, every coal development, everything proposed is legally challenged, activists or organisers, people have put into communities to organise against them, and as a result those developments are being slowed down. Meanwhile, gas got cheap, and therefore the utilities that were facing the pressure from environmentalists thought gas isn't so expensive anymore, maybe we should do gas. And the administration in the US put in place the threat of new regulations via the EPA on the coal industry, which meant the utilities thought putting a new coal plant in here could be very expensive. Not sure where the investment returns coming there. Maybe I should go over here, because then the green groups won't attack me anymore and the legal challenges won't be so difficult, and da-da-da-da-da. Right, now, of course, if you ask anybody in that system, the foundations all think they funded the campaigns against coal and destroyed it. Right? If you go and ask the resource companies, they say, oh, it's because gas was cheap. You greenies don't do anything. It's all about the market. Gas being cheap is the only thing that changed. The policymakers think that because they put in policy places to make that happen, they caused it. The answer is they're all right and they're all wrong, again, because the system changed. Now, that's how change occurs. Right? Now, what that means for us as a movement, right, is that this is really actually very, very good news. It's a source of hope, it's a source of optimism, because what it means is that everything we do starts to shift the system. Every action we take, which might seem small in its own right, is actually part of the process of shifting. So every time you have a conversation with your family about climate change, you're part of the solution. Every time an investor asks a question, is coal such a good idea anymore? Right, they're making the market nervous about that. When a bank says, well, you know, I can lend you the money for that coal mine, but it's going to cost you an extra % now because there's a bit more risk in the system here, that makes a difference. So what it means is this whole movement of change is happening when different people are pulling different levers, and everything we do is part of that process, and we're always part of that process because we can't always tell what that looks like. A friend of mine, Robbie Kelman, an old campaigner from Greenpeace, talked to me about campaigning and said, campaigning on these issues is like hitting yourself against a brick wall, right? And every time you do it, it really hurts. And the brick wall seems so strong and so impenetrable, but it's getting thinner and thinner from behind. Right? And as the wall gets thinner, every time you hit it, the dust falls off the back and it gets thinner and thinner, and it still looks like a brick wall. But then one day the brick wall is like rice paper and you just walk through it. Right? And that's again how change tends to occur, is we don't see the change coming until we're well and truly in process, and that's begun. So that's a really important part of thinking about the future of this movement. It's also important to remember that because of the way systems change, right, despite this movement of young people, activists campaigning against the world, against coal mines, against new gas plants and so on, despite that being huge, exciting and exhilarating, right, it's actually only part of this movement. This movement also includes the regulators. It also includes the movement, the people in investment banks asking questions. It includes the governments making policy decisions. It means, you know, all the people involved in this issue everywhere are part of this process, and therefore we're a lot stronger and a lot bigger than we think we are. Let's remember that in terms of the basics of climate science, that we have got a major problem and we need to act. This movement now is supported by the heads of state of the United States and China. This position is actually held in its favour by every government in the world virtually. Right? It's supported by most companies in terms of policy. They're not doing enough. Right? They're not acting yet, but the point is we don't have to convince them of the importance of the issue. And that means on the idea, as Tim said this morning, we've actually had an incredible breakthrough in the last few years where nobody, right, with half a brain, and there's a few of them without half a brain, actually questions the basics anymore. And that's a very exciting point, because that means this brick wall is getting thinner and thinner and thinner as we move forward. And that means this movement is now very large and very powerful. So what is the task that we have to achieve? Given that we are so powerful, given we are so big, given things are going so well, I'm not sure you don't all feel that every day, but believe me, you know, we are getting quite a long way at the moment in terms of levels of support. What is the task? Let's be really clear on what we have to achieve. Now, you've all heard about the carbon bubble, the work being done by Carbon Tracker in the UK on the 80% of fossil fuels that we can't afford to ever burn or ever sell, and what an incredible financial risk that is. We've heard about Bill McKibben this morning and the 350 campaign for divestment, which is one of the most exciting things happening, I think, in the climate movement in the world. And this all comes from a very simple piece of science that was done by some people from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research in 2009 on the carbon budget. It's a 6-page paper published in Nature by Bill Hare and some colleagues from there. Very important paper, which is what is behind the carbon bubble work. It's what's behind the 350 divestment work. It's what I've based my book, The Great Disruption, on. This very simple idea that to achieve a 2-degree temperature target and to have an 80% chance of achieving 2 degrees, there's a certain amount of carbon we can burn, as we've heard before. This is really the crucial piece of analysis that frames the strategy of this movement and it frames the task of what we have to achieve. And this is why it's so simple. Because beyond 2 degrees, life gets intolerable, right? Unmanageable. We all think 1 degree is the right answer. 1.5, maybe 2 degrees is terrible. But let's just accept 2 degrees for a moment as the line beyond which civilization gets unstable and possibly collapses. And let's, given that, say, well, how likely would you like not to go past that point? And let's accept 80% would be a good target, which is kind of really friggin' stupid if you ask me. We're talking about the collapse of civilization, 1 in 5 chance, bullet, okay, hopefully it won't go off. That's kind of crazy. But let's accept in this madness that 2 degrees is the wrong target, right, is what we're going for, and 80% chance of getting there is okay, which is not. But let's just compromise on that for a moment because everyone else agrees with that, because a lot of them are a bit silly. What that means is that we have only got a little bit of coal, oil and gas to burn. What it means is that we have to stop burning all coal, all oil and all gas in 20 years. 20 years. That means we have to remove the coal, oil and gas industries from the economy in 20 years. Right? Now, those companies may or may not change their strategies and do something else, but they will not be around as coal, oil and gas companies, because if they are, we're going past 2 degrees and we're not doing that. We're not going to accept that. So that is a scalar change that we think about and have to talk about, is just how big that economic transition is. Now, as well as doing that in 20 years, we therefore have to build a new world's biggest industry, because we didn't destroy the old one. We have to build a new one. Build a new energy industry which is actually clean, right, which is going to produce cheap energy, which is going to be available for everyone, which is going to be a lot more job intensive than the old one, and it's going to be as big as the old one in 20 years. So that's the task we got before us, right? If we accept the 2 degrees and 80%, if we accept any more than that, we have to go faster than that. So that is what we frame our strategy around, is this idea that we have to remove this industry and replace it in 20 years. When I say that to people, anywhere, environmental groups or business people or government people, they say, oh, that's not going to happen. I can't imagine that. That's just incomprehensible. So I can't imagine that level of change occurring. And my response to them and my response to you on that is I can't imagine it not occurring. Right? Because I can't imagine the idea that an intelligent, highly evolved civilization, which I know we don't think that every day, but we are, scary thought as it may be, this is as good as it gets, based on science, based on rational thought, based on logic. That's how we built this civilization. But we're going to stand at the edge of the cliff and look over it and go, over that cliff is the collapse of civilization, the collapse of the global economy, the descent into chaos, right? And not going there is a bit inconvenient, but we're going to sort of jump over the cliff. That's not going to happen. Right? There's just no way I can imagine us doing that. And there is nothing in history that says that we would consciously do that when we have a very simple choice not to. And it's very important to remember that is where we are today. That's what you have to imagine. Not can we change, right? But can we imagine not changing? Can we really imagine a world where the heads of state of every country, right, the leaders of most corporations, and an activist movement of millions of people like you holding them to account is not going to do that? Right? My answer is we are going to do that. We are going to change, and therefore we are going to transition this economy that fast, and that's how victory will come. That's how change will occur. So let me finish up with just a simple kind of idea, which is this. This is how change happens. People like you, right, changing light bulbs, opposing coal mines, shutting down gas plants, making it unacceptable for your friends to go and work for a coal company, right, recognising that your investments are going to change. Doing all these things every day is the only thing that ever changes a system, right? And it's the only thing that's going to change this issue, and it's the only way we're going to win. And this is what humanity is good at, waiting until the last minute and then doing a lot very quickly. If there was an epitaph to put on this civilization, it would be this. They were slow, but they weren't stupid. Thank you.